You think World War II started in 1939. You think it started when the panzers rolled into Poland. You are wrong. The deadliest war in human history didn't start with a bang. It started with the slow, agonizing stroke of a pen, 20 years earlier. And the price tag for that fatal mistake? $33 billion. Welcome to the story of the peace treaty that guaranteed the next war. Welcome to the story of Versailles. To truly grasp the catastrophe of World War II, you cannot look at tanks, trenches, or bombing runs. You have to look at paperwork. Imagine a world on fire. 4 long years of industrial slaughter. The mud, the gas, the endless, brutal trenches. By 1918, 20 million people were dead. Empires were shattered, reduced to dust. When the armistice was finally signed in November 1918, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. Peace, the war to end all wars, was finally, supposedly, over. But before we dive deep into the catastrophic mistakes made in that famous hall, I have to ask you, what single moment in the interwar period do you think made World War II inevitable? Drop your answer in the comments right now. If you're ready to unravel the 20-year chain reaction that led to global conflict, please hit that like button to support the channel and make sure you subscribe. We are covering the entire war, from the seeds of conflict to the final shots, and you don't want to miss a single chapter. Now, let's go back to the story, to the room where that peace failed. Because peace isn't just the absence of fighting. Peace is a state of mind, a shared agreement, a negotiation built on mutual respect and foresight. The Treaty of Versailles, the monumental document designed to finalize that peace, was none of those things. It was a vengeful political instrument designed to ensure that one nation, and one nation alone, paid the total, crushing price for the entire global conflict. It was a failure of imagination, a failure of pragmatism, and ultimately, a spectacular failure of humanity. To understand the ticking clock, we have to go to Paris, 1919. The Palace of Versailles, a magnificent, opulent, gilded cage. The symbolism was deliberate and cruel. This was the same Hall of Mirrors where the unified German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871, humiliating the French. Now, the roles were reversed. The terms were dictated by 3 men, the Big Three. You had Georges Clemenceau of France, the Tiger. His goal was vengeance and security. His nation was bled dry, and he wanted Germany destroyed permanently. Woodrow Wilson of the United States was the idealist, pushing his 14 points for a new world order, based on fairness and the League of Nations. He believed in restorative justice, but he was tragically outmaneuvered. Finally, David Lloyd George of Britain, the pragmatist, saw the danger. He knew excessive punishment would breed violent resentment, yet he was beholden to a public demanding Germany pay. The resulting treaty was a horrific compromise, harsh enough to create deep, furious resentment, but critically not harsh enough to permanently incapacitate the nation. It left Germany intact, but psychologically wounded, economically crippled, and ripe for extremism. The Germans themselves, forbidden from the talks, called it the diktat, the dictated peace. They felt they were victims of a brutal political execution. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't simply a mistake. It was a symphony of 4 catastrophic failures. 4 pillars of punitive measures that, when combined, guaranteed the rise of extremism and the destruction of the fragile Weimar Republic. First, the territorial humiliation. Germany was stripped of 13% of its European territory, losing economic powerhouses like Alsace-Lorraine and, most gallingly, the Polish corridor, which physically separated East Prussia from the rest of the nation. This created immediate, painful ethnic tension and a sense of being geographically castrated. The rich coalfields of the Saar Basin were given to France, and all colonial possessions were stripped away. Germany lost its global standing and its economic ability to recover. The second pillar, military castration. The German army, the Reichswehr, was limited to a minuscule force of just 100,000 men. Conscription was abolished. They were absolutely forbidden from owning tanks, heavy artillery, military aircraft, or U-boats. The entire industrial region of the Rhineland, the critical border with France, was permanently demilitarized. For a nation tied to military might, this was a profound humiliation. Worse, the 100,000-man limit forced Germany to retain only the most elite, highly motivated, and, crucially, anti-republican officers. This tiny, hand-picked force became the underground school for the next highly mechanized German military. The Allies thought they were destroying the army. They were only refining it for future conflict. But now we come to the third, and perhaps the most devastating, pillar. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. This single piece of text is the psychological bomb planted at the treaty's heart. It stated that Germany and her allies must accept sole responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the war. This was politically explosive. Their own government, the fragile Weimar Republic, was forced to sign a document admitting they were solely the villains. This act instantly created the environment for the infamous stab-in-the-back myth, or the Dolchstoßlegende. The belief that the German army didn't lose the war on the battlefield, but was instead betrayed by civilian politicians at home who signed this humiliating peace. This myth became the central organizing principle of the far right. Adolf Hitler became the master of exploiting this wound. He didn't have to convince the German people the treaty was unfair. The treaty itself did that job. He simply promised to tear up the diktat, and they followed him. And that brings us to the fourth pillar, the $33 billion reparations, the number in the title, the financial mistake that broke a nascent democracy and set the world on a new path to war. The total fixed in 1921 was 132 billion gold marks, or $33 billion, an impossible debt, roughly $500 billion in modern terms. The British economist John Maynard Keynes resigned, warning that the economic consequences would lead directly to chaos. He was right. Germany simply couldn't pay, so it printed money. The result was catastrophic, hyperinflation. By 1923, a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Savings vanished overnight. This was a societal collapse. It wiped out the German middle class, the democratic backbone of the Weimar Republic. Their trust in gradual change evaporated. They became desperate, radicalized, and ready to embrace any extreme solution, no matter how psychotic, that promised to restore their dignity and their savings. The reparations destroyed the legitimacy of the only force in Germany that could have stopped Hitler, the Weimar Republic. For a brief period in the mid-1920s, called the Golden Twenties, the crisis seemed to ease. The Allies, realizing their mistake, restructured the debt with the American-backed Dawes Plan and Young Plan. Germany stabilized, but this prosperity was built on artificial scaffolding, American credit. The $33 billion burden was still there, waiting. Then, in October 1929, the fragile scaffolding was kicked out from under them. The stock market crash of 1929 was a tsunami. American banks immediately called in their loans, and the German economy collapsed. Unemployment skyrocketed, reaching 6 million people by 1932. This financial cataclysm wiped out the last vestiges of democratic hope, driving voters straight to the political extremes, communism and, crucially, Nazism. The Nazis promised to restore dignity and, most importantly, to tear up the diktat. When Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, his foreign policy was singular. Dismantle the four pillars of the Treaty of Versailles, one by one. The countdown clock had moved from minutes to seconds. The first pillar to fall was the military restrictions. In 1935, Hitler openly defied Versailles, announcing conscription and building the army far past the 100,000-man limit. He unveiled the forbidden Luftwaffe and began mass production of tanks. The signatories, France and Britain, did almost nothing. They were paralyzed by the Great Depression and the memory of the trenches. This inaction taught Hitler the single most important lesson. The democracies are weak, risk-averse, and they will not enforce their own treaty. This greenlit the destruction of the territorial restrictions. In March 1936, Hitler played his most audacious gamble. He ordered the German military to march into the Rhineland, the crucial demilitarized zone. This was a direct, unambiguous violation. His generals were terrified. The French could have crushed them, but the French did not move. The British government deemed the act too trivial to risk a war. The German people cheered Hitler as a hero who had finally restored national honor. With the military and territorial pillars of the treaty now rubble, Hitler's path was clear. Meanwhile, the ultimate guardian of Versailles, the League of Nations, proved to be a toothless old dog. It was crippled from the start when the US never joined. Aggressive powers, including Japan in Manchuria, 1931, and Fascist Italy in Abyssinia, 1935, repeatedly violated international law. The League issued only weak protests and ineffective sanctions. Hitler confirmed his belief that the West would not fight. The final act of tragedy began with the Anschluss in 1938, the annexation of Austria, which was explicitly forbidden by Versailles. Hitler marched in, and the Allies did nothing. Then came the final fatal mistake, the Sudetenland crisis in late 1938. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. Instead of backing the Czechs, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich to negotiate directly with Hitler. This led to the infamous Munich Agreement, where Britain and France agreed to hand over the territory in exchange for Hitler's promise of peace for our time. This was the ultimate moment of appeasement. It was the moment they sacrificed a sovereign democracy for a fleeting promise of quiet. Chamberlain had merely proven to Hitler that the democracies would surrender anything to avoid war. The Czechs were betrayed. The act did not secure peace. It made war absolutely inevitable by convincing Hitler that the West was utterly weak and cowardly. The stage was set. Hitler had destroyed every major provision of the Versailles Diktat. But there was one last piece of the puzzle, one final grievance rooted directly in 1919, the Polish corridor. Hitler demanded its return. He did not believe Britain and France would fight. He was wrong. When German troops finally rolled into Poland on September 1st, 1939, they weren't just starting a new conflict. They were completing the vicious, self-fulfilling prophecy set in motion 2 decades earlier. The shell landed in 1939, but the fuse was lit in 1919. The $33 billion debt, the war guilt clause, the military castration, the territorial humiliation. They were not a peace treaty. They were the down payment on the next global catastrophe. It was the one mistake that didn't just lead to war, it guaranteed the next war. The men who wrote the Treaty of Versailles were driven by understandable, yet short-sighted, revenge. In their desire to punish the defeated, they ultimately punished the entire world, ushering in the darkest era in human history. That is how the world broke. It didn't break in a grand battle. It broke in a room over a signature because the people who were supposed to create peace failed to understand that the price of vengeance is always paid in blood, eventually. The story of World War II is the story of what happens when you substitute justice for humiliation. This is just the beginning of our deep dive into the Second World War. Next time we move forward. We've seen the cause, now we must look at the first act of the conflict, the Blitzkrieg. We will break down exactly how Hitler turned his illegally rearmed military into a terrifying, unstoppable force that crushed Europe in a matter of weeks. The fall of Poland, the miracle of Dunkirk, and the total rapid collapse of France. Click here to subscribe so you don't miss our next chapter. And let me know in the comments below, do you agree with Keynes? Was the Treaty of Versailles truly the single biggest blunder of the 20th century? Or was it the later policy of appeasement that truly made war inevitable? Tell me what you think. Thank you for watching.